You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
All right, welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I'm Zarak Khan. With me, as always, Eric Johnson.
Hello,
Say
everyone.
Hi, Eric. And for anyone playing the game, where in the world is Zarak? The answer is Florida. This episode, our guest is joining us from even farther away in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Rory Gallagher. Managing Director of the Asia Pacific branch of Behavioural Insights Team and co-author of the new book, Think Small. So thanks for joining us, Rory.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So to kind of just kick things off, why don't we have you sort of tell our listeners, who you are and a little bit about yourself, your background.
Of course. So my name's Rory. As Zarak mentioned, I head up the Behavioural Insights Team's work in the Asia Pacific. I'm based in Sydney, so the majority of the work that I'm sort of directly involved in is in Australia, but we've also recently set up offices in Singapore and New Zealand. Sorry, got a little bit of a cough this morning. And so we sort of work across the region trying to apply behavioural insights to make better policy and services. Awesome.
And you were in the UK for a while before that, right, with BIT?
Absolutely, yeah. So I've been with the team since it was set up in 2010. Before that, I was a public servant in the strategy unit in the UK. So my sort of background is I did a PhD in the social sciences, which looked at behaviour change and HIV/AIDS in Southeast Asia. I began to realise that the sort of academic route wasn't necessarily going to give me that link straight into social impact, and I'd probably get that more directly through work in government. So when I finished my PhD, I joined the UK Civil Service. I originally worked in the education department and then moved into what's called the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, linked to Number 10. And it was there that I met David Halpern. I was working on some families and education strategies and policies at the time, and he was asked to set up this new unit, popularly referred to as the Nudge Unit, but the idea at the time was, could it use some of this sort of new behavioural tools that were becoming sort of popular in political discourse, at least with some of our advisors in the new government, and could we apply that to public policy? So I was there, and when the team was set up in 2010, and spent a couple of years working primarily around issues around consumers, tax and fines, and then the employment work. And then in late 2012, I had the opportunity to be seconded out to the New South Wales government, which was, again, partly for professional and personal reasons. So on the professional sort of side of things, we wanted to see if these tools could work outside of the particular sort of political, organisational, bureaucratic and cultural context of Westminster. And for me, it was just a great opportunity to sort of fly the sort of safety net of the team in the UK and see if we could build this approach overseas. So came over here late 2012, originally seconded to the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet, and then helped them set up their own unit. They've now got a team of about a dozen people. And in 2014, we spun out of government in the UK Behavioural Insights Team and helped to establish our own presence here in Sydney. So, yeah, I've been sort of in the game, I guess, as it were, now for about 7 years. First couple in the UK.
A true OG, for sure.
Yeah, last 4 or 5 in much sunny and pleasant climes over here in Sydney.
Yeah, I was just
we were just
telling
discussing
Eric a few minutes ago about how great Sydney is.
Yeah, I haven't been yet, but both Zarak and then some other people have told me it's like the greatest city that they've ever been to, basically. So it's very high praise for it from what I hear.
Yeah, look, I'm very biased, but being able to live by the beach and be still sort of 5-10K from the CBD is a pretty amazing, pretty amazing place to live. And Aussies also, I think, have a great sort of can-do attitude, which is another reason I was really keen to move over here. Quite open to trying new things and a sort of let's just give it a crack. So it's a great place to live and work. I feel very, very fortunate, I have to say. Far less grey than London, so I have to make sure we don't send too many pictures of us having a good time.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I actually have a quick question. So related to so when you were doing your government work before the BIT actually formed, were you like actively applying some of the stuff you learned and doing your PhD and all that too much? Or I know like yeah, it can be done. You know, obviously it's difficult to run a full like RCT or something like that without like that backing. But how much were you able to like apply that before you had that like formal backing, or was it just more not as much?
Yeah, not really. I was on a sort of formal scheme at the time, Fast Stream, which is a sort of a production for sort of future leaders to come in, and they sort of move you around the departments, and you get lots of exposure to different parts of government. And so that was great for really schooling me in how government works, I guess, you know, seeing everything from the legislative side to the policy delivery and policy sort of design. So not a great deal of opportunity to apply these behaviour tools. And in fact, the education department has been relatively slow to come to the table, I guess, in the application of these tools, including both the behavioural tools and the experimental tools. I think for a while there was a sense that while it might be okay to, you know, run experiments on tax letters and, you know, change how we write to people, or maybe even slightly more controversially, but seemed to be okay, changing the way that we help deliver job support services, it was felt by some certainly that that wasn't okay in the education system, that it wasn't okay to sort of treat kids as guinea pigs and randomly allocate some classes or schools to one condition and some schools, you know, to another. I think that has matured over time, and there's been a recognition that effectively that's what's happening every day anyway, in the way that teachers will be taking their own different take on the syllabus or ways of teaching, and actually we'd be much better to do that in a more structured and empirical and evidence driven way. So education now is a really, really exciting place to work, I think, in terms of the application of these tools, but certainly when I was there, that wasn't at the sort of forefront of the sort of policymakers' toolbox. And so it wasn't really until we started with BIT that we began to use these tools in a more deliberate way and be able to sort of test and experiment in a sort of in a more routine way. So yeah.
And to give BIT chance to plug BIT again, you guys just came out with a new tool for education, right? Like a texting tool, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So based on some of the trials that we're running, really exciting in sort of further education. So kids in their sort of later years post school, we know many of those students drop out, and we wanted to run a series of interventions, see if we could get them to keep attending their classes, do better at class as well. And the early results are really, really promising. It looks like simple sort of text reminders, and particularly things where it draws on people's social network. So what we call study supporters, but sending text to people that they nominate, might be a friend or a relative, about what that young person is learning and encouraging them to engage in that. Seems to be really effective at getting people not only to turn up, but to pass their exams or achieve better. But one of the interesting things at BIT is often we're not able to necessarily take things to scale, or we might come up with an intervention like things around debiasing recruitment, but actually it's quite hard for policymakers to implement that. So part of our organisation is increasingly now looking at what we call BI Ventures, but it is trying to actually develop some of those tools to help them take to scale. Now that's a pretty challenging space to get into. We're having to get people with new skills. You know, we are generally people with, you know, policy background, strategy background, behavioural background. We are not people with experience of building web platforms and tech platforms. And so, you know, we've needed as an organisation to get those skills in. But it's a really exciting time. And, you know, watch this space. We're hoping that, you know, we are able to develop more of these tools which actually help our interventions go to scale.
Yeah, it's interesting. We sort of do sort of similar stuff, in not necessarily in the behavioral context, but in my work of, you know, every day we're sort of doing strategy consulting, management consulting, but then, you know, you get to a certain point and you're like, you know, actually we have a pretty good idea for like a product that you could develop and then take out there, and it's exciting to see that stuff kind of grow and become a bigger part of your work.
Yeah, it's super exciting. I think it's probably been more challenging than we expected.
Sure, it always is.
The lead time,
overconfidence bias every time.
Absolutely, we are subject to all of those biases ourselves. Hopefully, we'll talk about it later on. But it's super exciting, and you know, it does feel different seeing a product in the market and in place is different in some ways to writing a paper or even seeing a trial.
And you get different feedback from it too, like you have different, people who are using it, and it's sort of just like you kind of think about it differently, I think, as well. So it's very, very cool. And yeah, look, I hope there's a few more discussions we're having about new products, including in stuff like the goal setting space as well. So we'll see. Well, as you said, it's a really exciting, definitely with products. They're not guaranteed to be successful. So I think we'll take not quite 1,000 flowers bloom, but we'll definitely try a few different things and then see, where our real value add is, what works and what doesn't. But, Well, I actually have a question about goal setting for later on in our conversation, just so that I want the listeners to know that we actually do plan this a little bit.
May not sound like it.
I
think. Sorry,
go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to kind of think about that transition. So you do like the projects and experiments, then that sort of lends yourself, like the stuff you find that works there lends you to start thinking how you can productize some of the stuff you do in experiments. But then it's also like, it's such a, like I remember reading an article a while back how like just the smartphone is like basically the biggest, potentially the biggest impact, could potentially have the biggest impact on like human behavior that we've like ever seen. So like we've never had this amount of data, like people that are using this like constantly all day. And there's just like never been this opportunity to have such clear data about what people are doing and how they're doing it in a lot of ways. So like a lot of ways, it's just like it's such like a logical extension from just, the work you're already doing, running experiments in the field and things like that. And then taking advantage of this, machine that we all have that is just, basically built for kind of behavioral interventions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, we'll have to adapt and move with that as people's reactions and behavior to that change. I mean, even the platform we were just talking about, Promptable, is essentially an SMS platform. But, it's highly likely in 5 years' time, probably definitely in 10 years' time, that the sort of main method of communication is not SMS. It will be some form of communication, and we'll have to move with it. And one of the reasons that we find SMSs are so powerful in shifting behavior is because they are so immediate and personal and short, and as yet are not subject to huge amounts of spam, like our email. But it's very easy to see a world in not too distant future where your text sort of inbox becomes full of junk messages. And so actually trying to work out, even when we're sending sort of text messages to students, what's the right frequency, what's the right time of day, what's the right tone, all of that stuff we still need to learn and continually evolve as people's preferences change and as people switch modes of communication. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The phone for us is a huge sort of tool for us to use in many, many different ways, and at the minute we're only really scratching the surface. Many of the things that we're using at the minute don't even get anywhere near the potential you have, as you said, in terms of the type of data that it's holding, everything from location to the sorts of things that you're surfing, etc. But we will also have to be careful, obviously.
That's going to be my next comment. It's like, it's almost a little bit too much power at times too.
Absolutely. I mean, there's one thing with the tax office, writing you a letter to tell you're overdue, or that you've got a test coming up, or whatever it may be. It's quite another thing to feel that that's quite personal, arriving in your inbox unsolicited when you're out for dinner in the evening. Or, again, even using that data in more fine-grained ways to not only text you, but sort of send you a message targeted on what you've been surfing on the internet that day. Now, we may accept that from social media platforms and retail platforms. I think it's fairly likely that unless it's done really, really well, that will seem less acceptable for governments to do that.
For sure.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Naturally skeptical of governments a little more. Although I feel like increasingly skeptical of like other like private companies too.
Yeah, and look, as you all know, trust is hard won and easily lost. And while people are sort of skeptical, I think, of politics and government to some extent, there is still a large amount of authority and credibility that comes with sort of government and the messaging. And so, we always have this slight tension of making messages as engaging as possible and as personal as possible. But most people don't want a message, particularly if it's to do with some compliance thing, being, in a completely informal way. Rory, mate, how you doing? It's not the voice of government. So thinking about how we engage people in a really personal way, but in an authentic way that still speaks to what government is about, is actually an interesting challenge to us to think through. And that's sometimes where we draw that line between coming from a particular government worker, your case manager or someone who can talk in a much more personal, informal way, and something that is seen to come from the sort of heart of the bureaucracy or government. Again, changing up that tone and how and when you use it, I think something that we need to, keep an eye on and learn a lot more about.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance. Like we were into this a little bit too. Like when you think about how you want to communicate effectively, like the more personal and more natural it feels, generally the better. But there's also sort of like the branding thought of it too. Whereas like, there's like really new startups that will send me these super informal, like sometimes like almost like inappropriate jokes and stuff. And it is engaging and like, it's funny, but like that would not make sense coming from like what we do, and that would be very off brand. So it's the same thing for like the government. It's like, you want to balance that of not being the like super dry bureaucratic sounding, but you also don't want to like veer too much into like, why does this tax person think they're like my buddy now?
You're absolutely right. I mean, we're starting to experiment a couple of sort of experiments which look at curiosity, that are sort of encouraging people to think about why are we asking this. But you can see this. It's a very fine balance, and it'll only be through testing that we work out how to get that right. But I think you're absolutely right. There's a big risk there. And when I was in government, particularly including the education department, government comms for young people were often written in a way which we thought would be how to engage with young people, but often ended up just sounding inauthentic and not done well. So that's, again, how do you then think about how do you use other young people to communicate? How do you use their networks, etc., which are always going to be more powerful and authentic than sort of putting a youth spin or something on government comms.
So I'm kind of curious, you've obviously been applying this stuff for a long time and studying it for even longer. At what point in that process did you, obviously after finishing a PhD, you've demonstrated the capacity to sit down and write a book probably, but at what point along the line did you sort of think, I would want to write a book, and think small as the book that you wanted to write?
Yeah, I didn't turn my PhD into a book. I wanted to sort of get on and do stuff, I guess. And it was only really in the last couple of years that we thought there was something new and different to say that we weren't sort of putting out through our formal work channels. Much of the publications we've been involved in through the team and our sort of professional day jobs have been policy papers or occasionally academic journal papers. They weren't necessarily pitched at the sort of, everyday sort of reader on the bus, on the plane, etc. They were written with a slightly more sort of policy focus. So it's probably a couple of years ago now that me and Owen were having a conversation about the fact that we were increasingly using these tools in our own lives, and we were seeing the potential to apply what we did in our day jobs at home. That actually, we thought maybe we have something interesting to say, and towards the end of the sort of calendar year, we sort of got together and put a sort of rough structure down and started to have conversations with a couple of publishers, and decided, well, let's give it a crack. So yeah, it wasn't sort of a lifelong ambition to write a book or something that we've been thinking about since we first set up the unit. It happened relatively organically and relatively quickly towards the sort of end of 2015, and then we wrote it over 2016, and now it's coming out.
I read it last week, and I found it really engaging and interesting because, having read a lot of the books that are out there, it's some of the stuff that, not everyone that is engaged with this stuff, or certainly people that are new to it, they're not necessarily like subscribed to the BIT's emails like I am. So I see like some of these papers where, that you refer to, and the mechanisms that you talk about. But it was really interesting to see like some of those examples, but then applied to, your personal life. I mean, it was, to me, it almost felt like I haven't really ever read like a self-help book, but like a behaviorally informed self-help book, this is how, if you want to set these goals for yourself, like here's like the behavioral science behind it, and here's how you can kind of structure that. Is that like a fair assessment, or how would you describe it?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, we've always had this slightly and curiously tense relationship with the self-help aisles and the self-help book, that we feel quite sensitive about being it labeled as self-help. And that's just partly because much of the self-help literature is full of unevidenced sort of chapters and inspirational stories,
or very selectively applied evidence.
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly right. That's actually a really good point. They might take one bit of the evidence, maybe visualizing success, and then they take that and build a whole sort of mantra around that. If you just think positive, great things will happen, and there is of course some evidence for that. But actually, what we've found is that many of those books don't bring those different tools together, and they don't do it in an evidence-based way. So that was our attempt, I guess, to do that, was to say, look, there's all sorts of great literature out there, and everything from, you know, well-being to choosing the right sort of goals, through to planning, implementation, intentions, how you go about setting commitments. Really interesting and quite nuanced literature around the use of rewards and feedback, etc. And then obviously some of the more recent literature around things like grit and sort of perseverance, etc. And that was the attempt. Could you sort of bring those literatures together? And quite often what our team tries to do is give people a simple framework. Often it's public servants for using these tools. And that was what the sort of attempt was to do there, and then to draw on examples from our own life, as well as those sort of around us. Obviously, we are both fairly similar in our demographics, so middle-aged white men. So you know, the examples that we were able to draw from personally were relatively limited, but we tried to then draw on the work of the team and other examples around that as well, to try and, as you said, just give people who want to sort of get on and achieve stuff and live a slightly better life some tools for doing that.
Well, maybe to kind of jump off from there, do you want to walk through maybe one of the, I mean, you talked to a couple of them in the book at certain places, but maybe some of the ways that you have applied it in your own life that spurred you to write it?
Sure. I mean, probably the one that kick-started my thinking about this whole approach was when I was doing the work in job centres. So the book actually starts with a story about a guy that was in a job centre and he was looking for work. And we had re-engineered the way that these sorts of conversations were happening in job centres. One of the main changes that we made was to introduce what is called in the literature implementation intentions and these commitment devices. So rather than, when people came into the job centres, rather than spending their precious time with advisors, you know, between 10 and 20 minutes, rather than having that as a retrospective conversation, going through what had that person done over the last week to look for work, which becomes, you know, a more of a compliance conversation, we wanted to shift that so that when people came in, they were having a conversation which was specifically about what they were going to do the next week to look for work, but do it in a much more structured and focused way than that was currently happening. So generally what would happen previously is people would come in, they'd spend most of that conversation going over and making sure that people had done what said that they were going to do to look for work, and then have a quick conversation at the end, which is what are you going to do this week, and that would generally end with I'm going to look for work. Right. Or maybe if you were lucky, you know, I'm going to look for retail jobs. And actually what we did was give them those simple tools, the sort of if-then plans, so that when they were having those conversations, they'd sit down and say, it's not just I'm going to look for retail jobs, but on Tuesday morning after walking the dog, I'm going to go and look for retail jobs on Loughton High Street or whatever local town it was. So that really got me thinking, and we saw sort of firsthand how powerful some of those tools were in just shifting that conversation and helping people to really plan, particularly people who often may have had slightly chaotic lives at home, or just had lots of stuff going on. And so actually just that sitting down and planning seemed to be really helpful to help them sort of structure what they were doing to look for work. The irony, of course, was I wasn't at the time using those same principles in my own life. So whilst I was going in and training job centre staff about how to use these tools, I was then coming home in the evening and failing to go to the gym repeatedly. And you mentioned opposition bias every day. I mean, I would still take in my gym kit every day and think, you know, it's all right, that'll keep me in when I get home. I'll make sure
Plus, there's got to be some benefit of just lifting the gym kit up and down.
Yeah, fairly marginal.
Tiny habits, gotta start small. Yeah.
Like genuinely, it gave me, I think, I think it was almost backfiring. There's almost some like warm glow effect of packing up your gym kit and then taking it with you, thinking like, well, yeah, I really am a healthy person. Just wasn't able to do it today. And I'd even tried different techniques. So I mentioned in the book, originally I joined a gym, which I sort of thought was a form of commitment device, but again, as we know, a pretty ineffective and loose one. People sign up, spend a load of money thinking, well, now I'm financially invested, that'll tie me into going. Didn't quite work out that way. And then I sort of diagnosed the problem that, well, it's where I live, which is, you know, a little bit out of the central London where I'm working. It was down in a place called Richmond in London, probably sort of half an hour to an hour commute outside. And I sort of, I felt that the problem was just really the location of the gym, and that if I could move that, go to a gym at work, this would be solved overnight. I'd make it easy to do so, etc. So I did that. again, probably worked for the first week, and then I found very quickly I dropped off going. And partly because it was then on my doorstep. It was the work gym. It was exactly in the same building. I always felt like, well, I'll just go tomorrow. I can go tomorrow lunch. I can go tomorrow after work. And again, just failed to go. So, there was this sort of slight irony, really, or disjuncture between me preaching in the day to job centre staff about how they can be using these planning tools to follow through on things that they want to do, and then coming home from work and not doing the things that I was saying I was going to do or hoping to do in terms of going to the gym. So I decided I was going to try and practice what I preach, and commandeered the sort of whiteboard in the office and wrote up that I would go to the gym regularly twice a week for the next 3 months. And if I didn't, this is the important part, I also had a sort of anti-incentive in there that I was going to buy and wear a Robin Van Persie shirt to the office. Now, Robin Van Persie, for those that aren't Premiership football fans at the time, was the sort of lead striker for the team that I support, local rivals. So I'm a Tottenham Hotspur, a Spurs fan, and Arsenal are our rivals, and Robin Van Persie was their sort of main striker. So coincidentally, Owen...
It sounds like a very painful punishment, yeah.
It would have been very painful, particularly because I'd asked to be my sort of commitment referee and make sure that I was doing it, and I was sort of ticking off when I was going to the gym. He is a big Arsenal fan, and for about the last 20 years, they have finished above us and have continued to taunt us. I'm pleased to say that this year we finished ahead of them for the first time in over 2 decades. But at the time, we were the sort of, they're whipping boys. So that seemed to me like a pretty heinous thing to have to do, and acted, as the sort of final piece of the puzzle, I guess, to help motivate me. And so it was really successful. I went regularly for 3 months and then continued to go after that incentive was taken away, after that commitment was made. It sort of created that habit, which then became self-sustaining. So for me, it was sort of a light bulb moment in some ways to think, well, you're applying this in your professional life. Can you use it in your personal life to live a slightly better lifestyle, I guess?
Well, and I thought it was a great introduction to the book because it's something that I think is really accessible to people who don't know anything about behavioral science. So it's just like, everyone has these goals, right? Or like everyone has the idea of wanting to set these goals. But I thought that one of the most interesting things about this book is that it also, I think, can appeal to someone who has some background in behavioral science, like maybe they've read some of the other popular books, but they're not sure. And like, there's tons of people that we talk to all the time. A lot of people in action design, I think, feel this way or have expressed this. They want to start learning how to apply this stuff. And so we had a talk with a speaker in DC a few months ago who had pitched the idea of doing a talk on what he was calling micro experiments. And so he was basically saying, I want to come in and talk about how you can just try to get your family to drink apple juice instead of orange juice by moving things around on the shelf, or, these sorts of things that, they're very simple goals. And obviously, with yours, there's a framework, so you can make the goal as simple or as challenging as you want, or complex as you want. But I think his idea, and I agreed with it, is that it's an easier sort of entree to the subject and to learning about this stuff, because a lot of times I think people are interested in it because they're like, I want to solve this huge social problem. And it's something that, like, even if you have the right idea, it's going to take, years to implement and years to test and all this stuff. And if you're trying to learn on this really complex issue, which may be the issue, obviously you're more passionate about that than you are about apple juice, it can be a little bit confusing and kind of like a harder thing to kind of wrap your head around. And so I liked that the way that that your book lays it out, kind of allows you to build it from anything. So you could start with something simple and you could learn these behavioral principles that you could then obviously apply to your own work or to something else later on. So it was, in my mind, kind of like the flip side of, learning this stuff, but from a different angle, and one that's potentially more accessible.
Yeah, it gets really to like common humanity. It's like every one of us has something in our personal life that we want to be doing, but we're not. And often it's the gym, or it's saving money, or things like that. And yeah, I think as a field, we tend to talk about those at a very macro level. Like, how can we build this product that just like helps somebody do this? But there's also just like individual behavioral change, like how do you do it yourself? How do you start with yourself and then build that up? And it's easy to go top down instead of bottom up.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, to your point as well earlier about the smartphone, I mean, there are no end of these sorts of tools and prompts now that can help you to do that as well. And I think sometimes they can be a huge help, and it enables us to do it much easier than we could have done in the past. We're able to track, for example, how much we're moving each day in a way that would never have been possible, 5-10 years ago. I think there are some risks around it, and people see the sort of texts or apps as a sort of easy solution, and they sort of quickly wear off. But the point about starting on yourself, I think, is a really nice one. And the example around apple juice, while seeming similarly trivial, is actually quite a nice example of actually, if it might be around changing your family's eating patterns, tackling obesity in you and your family's life. That's a pretty hard thing to shift, actually. But actually, taking those steps and breaking that down, and it might be that apple juice is a relatively minimal contributor to that. But
right.
I've also found that those sorts of small steps show that change can be made, and that in and of itself acts as a form of motivation, that you feel like, well, I've made that one change, so I've changed from Coke to apple juice. Now what's next? Maybe I can cut out, the sugar or cake or whatever it might be. And again, even there, the way that we sort of try and think about it, and again, diet, I think, is something we all sort of struggle with, and it's a really hard thing, and we see lots and lots of yo-yo diets, etc. But it is those sort of simple changes that then can become sustainable. Simple things like not having beers in the house or crisps in the house, which again we sort of highlight is that tension that they're relatively simple things, but we know that our future selves are much more well behaved than our current selves. So I know if there are no crisps and beers in the house, I'm not going to go out to the shop and buy one when I get home from work when I'm a bit tired and stressed. And yet when they are in the house, they go pretty quickly. So in fact, I recently had my birthday and had loads of people over for barbecue. We got loads of beers left over. And pretty much every night since, I've had a beer or two when I get back from work.
That's right there.
The stock runs out, I'm sure.
And you're like, it's been a long day. I deserve this beer,
Exactly. I've got a baby now. It's very tiring, etc., etc. And I find my self-discipline on that is really poor at the minute, partly because as I said, we've got sort of newborn, and that's taking most of my mental sort of energy and work. But if it wasn't in the house, there's no way. I've stopped buying beers, on a sort of regular basis. So I wouldn't usually have it. So I think you're exactly right. I like that sort of term around micro experiments. I mean, the slightly difficult thing is, in terms of actual experiments, there are so many confounding factors when you're just dealing with one person that it's actually quite difficult to know what is really making the difference, as opposed to, one of the great benefits of working in the jobs that we do is that we get to run these experiments on hundreds, thousands, sometimes even millions of people, and can be pretty sure about isolating exactly, what it is that's having the effect. When you're doing that for yourself, that's pretty hard to do. But I absolutely think your point is right, which is make those changes, track it, see if it works. If it's not working, try something else. In fact, one of my colleagues here just ran a marathon recently, and he took that sort of adaptive approach the whole way through his training, just trying little different things, like actually kept getting blisters on his feet. Well, if I will try this type of plaster, does it stop? If I actually running in this manner, or try these trainers. And actually those really small little changes and micro experiments, as you said, along the way can actually then lead to much, much better outcomes. And in this case, leading to him finishing the marathon, which was very good.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind as we're talking about that, like the apple juice example, again, is interesting because you think about a lot of these bigger behavioral interventions you do at the macro level, you're always trying to find those like high impact, low effort interventions you can do. So like I remember the one from the BIT, which I think it was like a tax payment or something, where it's just by using some sort of social proof, like X amount of people pay their taxes on time or something like that. And that's like a really low cost is changed to a message that had a big impact. So you can think about those same things at your personal level, like, like stopping drinking a sugary drink like apple juice every day isn't going to be the ultimate ticket, but maybe that's like a big part of the calories you're taking in every day. So like just getting that one thing might have a disproportionate impact, even though it's a one simple habit, So it's interesting to think about those things. Like there's probably little things that are having disproportionate amount of the results that you don't want, that you could just work on that one thing and get started on that way. And then also think about the micro experience and the progress. Like once you start making get those small wins, it's like it kind of starts becoming a part of your identity to an extent. And like, I don't know how much you've looked into sort of that sort of thing. Once you kind of start getting some of these small wins, like you're like, oh, I'm a person who can eat healthier or can exercise and stuff like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's, again, that's something we've explored, as you said, both in the sort of professional lives, and again, not just in weight, but we are the sorts of kids that turn up. We are the sorts of kids that perform well at work, and it can be those relatively small things and that's what this book is really about. And one of the criticisms of it that we're probably overly sensitive to, but I think is fair to some degree, is aren't these just sort of tinkering at the edges? This is really just about making these very small micro changes, which really, in aggregate, don't have a lot of impact. This isn't really about big goals. And I think actually what the argument is actually these can be about big goals. This can be about big achievements. But the think small element is not about a small goal. It's about the small steps that you need to take in order to get there. And as you mentioned, it quite often needs to start with those small changes, which give you this sense of purpose, motivation, and identity that then lead on to making the more radical changes in your personal life that you might need to make in order to reach that bigger goal. Going to that right from the start, suddenly going on a zero carb diet or something, if you've not tried any other techniques, it's probably quite a big jump. As you said, once you've made some of those smaller changes, you actually become much more motivated. You think, actually, I am the sort of person that can stick to these regimes, for example. But also, one of the other big messages from the book, which I took away as probably more powerful than when I was coming into it, was the power of other people and social networks. So the share chapter really highlights that if you want to achieve a goal, one of the best ways to do that is to work with others to do that. And again, that's why it's interesting to reflect, that it is the self-help literature all really focuses on the individual and the self. Whereas actually, in order to achieve your own goals, you're often better to do that and link in with other people. So, I'm just thinking about the sort of diet example from my own life. I got married a few years ago now, and that was the first sort of diet that I'd done. And I think the only way I was able to stick to it, we did the sort of 5-2 diet, where you have 2 days where you really don't eat very much, very strict calorie count, 5 days you can eat normally. It was only really because I was doing that with my fiance at the time, now wife, that we were able to sort of push each other on and get to do that and cook meals that were much more healthy together. Mm-hmm. One of the other messages I think that I took away from this book for my own life was to actually think about what it is that you really want to achieve, and then think about what are the ways that you can work with others to do that, including, of course, on the book itself. I'm pretty certain this book would never have got written if I was writing it on my own. And I'd like to think that it was a better book because the two of us wrote it together, because we both brought slightly different perspective and skills and sort of a take on things. And even actually to go back to your point, I guess, on micro experiments. I mean, we tried to use these principles from the book in writing it itself, and we had to change our approach along the way. So when we first set out, we set ourselves a sort of overall deadline. We were writing it from sort of Jan. We wanted to be finished by December. We wanted a full first draft by September, and then we sort of set ourselves sort of 6 weekly milestones to get the chapters done. And we sort of split up the chapters. Once we had the rough structure, you do this chapter, I'll do that chapter, drawing on where we felt our sort of best knowledge of the evidence were and best examples. But we wrote the first couple of chapters and then came together and realized that, not surprisingly perhaps, it looked like it had been written by two different people. It had been by two different people. And we started editing each other's sort of chapters and then realized it was still a mishmash of voices going on. And so whilst it was a really productive thing to do it together, there were some challenges, and we soon had to work out a strategy, which is, look, we're going to end up with a book which sounds like it's written from, many different perspectives, unless we get a consistent tone. So then we split up the tasks in a different way. So we'd both sort of agree what the main sort of structure of the chapter would be. I would then go away and sort of populate in bullet form what the sort of narrative is and what the studies we were going to use. And then Owain would take that sort of format and put it into a nice prose and narrative, and I would then come back and edit it down. And actually, I think because of that process, the output was much better at the end because you had two people's take in each chapter and sort of to and from and critiquing each other's ideas, but also a more consistent tone than if we'd done what we first saw, which is we'll split the book in two, you write half, I'll write half, and then we'll somehow staple it together and hope that it's okay.
And it definitely does sound consistent. Like as I was reading it, I would kind of think, and I was like, I wonder who wrote this part. And so that kind of makes sense to me now. Why I couldn't really ever point out like, oh, this sounds like Rory wrote it, or this sounds like somebody else. So
yeah, no, it definitely sounds more like Owain because Owain did the sort of main drafting of the prose. And in fact, I was speaking to my dad the other day, like, this really doesn't sound like you. And I was like, no, that's probably because actually the sort of final prose is primarily written by Owain. And I think we just found that sort of my writing style was more academic, I think, and less engaging. And I think, again, that can be a hard realization to have, but is an important one, right? If you're for this audience, actually the tone that you want is slightly more informal, slightly more engaging, etc. So, yeah, it wasn't necessarily the sort of easiest journey writing it when you're trying to combine two different views and writing styles, but for me, much better outcome than if I'd sat down and tried to write this book alone.
I love I really like that in the chapter around goal setting, in addition to just sort of like talking about like the importance of goal setting, and because you kind of mentioned a moment ago setting the right goal, and I thought you guys did a great job of including sort of corollary research or complementary research around things that make people happy, like things that are good goals. So not necessarily just to things that are totally self-centered, right? So I guess again in this sense, you would sort of not necessarily call it like self-help, because while you are doing something for yourself, there's also all this literature on how it's good for other people, and how when you're doing something for somebody else, there's an aspect of that is more powerful for you, and you feel better about it as well. So I like that there was additional information other than just set a goal and then now we're moving on to the next step. Yeah,
it was. I mean, that was one of our harder sections to write because we were basically trying to cram in a very complex and dense literature on well-being into 3 pages, which was really difficult to do. And thinking about what's a simple framework for getting people who have never engaged with the well-being literature to start thinking about it was actually pretty hard. And we drew on a report from the Neff Foundation to sort of just some simple principles about the kinds of things. And I do think it's really important. I think many of us, when you think about what you want to do better, you immediately sort of look into stuff around career, savings, very personal things. And they may be absolutely the right things. You may still want to work with others. But there are other things we know that make people much happier, investing in your social relationships, volunteering, and those other things. And we thought it was just important before people sort of just dive in, as you say, to, right, this is about how I achieve this goal and spend the next 6 months, a year doing that, just to get them to pause before they do that and think through, like, why are you doing this? If you achieve this, will it really make you happier? Will it really improve your well-being? And I think there's a fair shout that many of the goals that people set themselves actually don't end up with them, even if they achieve them, being any happier at the end of the day. So yeah, I thought that was a difficult section to write, but I thought it was an important one just to get people to pause and take that step back and think about what it is. And absolutely, I mean, for me, this year is mainly about making sure, fatherhood, that I spend as much time and energy making sure that I'm there and present for the sort of birth of my child, and really focus on that relationship and the sort of friends and families around supporting that, and maybe slightly less on some of the other things that I also want to achieve in terms of my own health and fitness and other things. But actually, really for the next 6 months, that's what it needs to be all about, investing in that important relationship. I think ultimately that make me much happier than if I decided I was going to write another book or open another office or do something else over these next 6 months.
Totally. I also like that in the spirit of, making things easy and giving people a framework. At the end of the book, there is this sort of almost like a worksheet or checklist to kind of help people plan out and go through the steps that you lay out in all the chapters. And as I was reading it, and I was speaking with one of our city organizers, Robin Kriegelstein, yesterday, we were talking about these like chat-based and text-based apps and services and that sort of thing. And it kind of got me thinking. And then when I was thinking about the BIT stuff and the one that you guys have just launched with education. It's like, oh, this could maybe even be a good candidate for something like that as well. I mean, potentially more complicated, but that could, I don't know, is that like an application that you guys have thought about, or is that sort of...
Yeah, we absolutely have thought about, okay, there is many of the things and the sort of golden rules, as we call them, which we had to try very hard to avoid terrible puns around golden rules. And again, the nature of the books was very hard to resist some of those terrible puns. But absolutely, I think there are set rules and tools that you can use that could be developed through an app, and we are looking at those types of things at the minute. I mean, it was difficult. I mean, there were some conversations about where those sort of longer list of rules and sort of checklists should sit. And I think our sort of fear was, and our publisher's fear was, if you never had that up front, people wouldn't actually read the book. They'd just go through and use a simple checklist and they wouldn't really engage.
Right.
And so that was the thinking before, to like trying to encourage people to read the book and then use those tools. Mm-hmm. But I think it's helpful to bring them out and sort of put them front and center. And the idea is obviously not that for every goal you need to use all of these 7 tools and all of these 21 rules, but it's to work out, well, for this particular goal, what is those combinations of things that you think you could use. But yeah, we absolutely are. I think there's some work going on in our ventures team again at the minute around are there sort of simple apps and technologies that could just help you to achieve fitness goals or health goals. You know, it might not be something that we can develop for all goals, but actually those sorts of simple prompts and reminders and ways of creating feedback loops and study supporters and social networks. I think that there are tech solutions there that could be very helpful. But as we said before, there's lots already out there in the market. So the question is, you know, what's the real value add of something that we build?
Yeah.
I have one comment, then we'll jump into sort of the finishing questions. But so on that note, think about how you can like apply this, and you know, if there's an app or something like. One thing you mentioned stood out to me was about how the social aspect is so important to this, like having someone else there or having a community around you. Like, and I've kind of noticed that myself, that I feel like a lot of if you really want to have some sort of individual change, you know, a lot of what we talk about behavioral science is like, you know, your environment plays so much into your behavior, and a lot of that is your social network. So, I mean, if you're trying to work out more, but you only have people that never work out, like it's going to be that much harder. So like, what would you like your recommendations for how somebody, obviously you can get sort of a referee or like a coach or somebody who's on you, but like, is there any other ways you recommend like adding that social pressure for a goal that you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. To me, that, as I said, is one of the most interesting bits of the book. And again, not only did we resist sort of going down this, you know, or we had questions around the sort of self-help terminology. But again, there was lots of questions about, is this really about self-nudges? And in a way, it absolutely is. But again, we avoid using that term too front and center, because I think it, again, draws you back to the self and the individual. And as I think you're pointing out, actually the best way to achieve many of these things is actually to link up with others. And look, there are various different ways of doing that. One nudge, yeah, absolutely. And you know, one of the things is just to ask for help. We often don't think of doing that. We often sort of just battle on our own, and actually we've showed sort of simple experiments where people just go and ask people for help. More often than not, people will say yes. So if you say, actually, look, I really want to make sure I leave work on time so I can get home and bath my kids, you know, actually just saying to the rest of your team or, you know, your office manager, can you make sure I leave at this time, will make it way more likely that you do that, because when it comes to 5 or 6 or whatever time and say, right, Rory, make sure you get out of here, that prompt is far more powerful than any alarm you probably put on your phone or some other mechanism to do that. So simply asking people for help. Other things, you know, it depends on what your goal is, but we've found things like joining clubs or joining networks can be really powerful. So that's one of the reasons things like Weight Watchers are so powerful. They have these sort of accountability mechanisms where you're coming back in, sharing your stories, but also you're helping each other and giving that sort of motivation. And finally, you know, actually thinking about it at an organizational level, we have this thing called FitFeb, which we mentioned in the book, which has this sort of competition between offices, where through Feb you get points for different types of healthy activity. And it is amazing how powerful that sort of social network, but also competition is in spurring people on to do more for that month. So yeah, look, I think it's almost, you know, it comes later in the book, but it should be front and center when you think about and you decide and you're planning for how you're going to achieve that goal. Thinking about how you're going to draw on and work with others is absolutely, I think, one of the most powerful mechanisms to making sure you do actually follow through.
Well, I may be in the minority of readers here, but my main criticism of the book was that you didn't follow through with all of the puns that you could have. So something to keep in mind if you do a second edition.
I won't. I will send you some of the excellent suggestions I had from the team for book titles. None of which were serious. All of which were excellent puns, but none of which our publisher was keen. But
Zorak can be a copy editor specifically for puns.
Yeah, okay. Well, if you do a second, I will come to you because I do feel slightly disappointed we didn't get a few. Even the golden rules in each chapter, we didn't, bring that as much as perhaps we could or should. So yeah, one for volume 2, I guess.
Totally. So we're coming to the end of our time here, but I wanted to ask because you mentioned so many. You guys obviously you do a great job of referencing all of the people and organizations in the book that are doing really great work. And so I was kind of curious, who are some of the either people or organizations that you think are out there that are kind of doing some of the most innovative stuff in the field?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have a sort of, from an organizational point of view, I guess I have my own sort of biases in terms of the stuff that I'm exposed to, which is these days tends to be in the Asia Pacific. Certainly in Australia, the New South Wales department here are doing great stuff. The federal government have recently set up work, and the Singaporean government have lots of teams at the minute doing really excellent stuff. Internationally, obviously, we had the White House team led by Maya Shankar that was doing great stuff, and the Ideas 42, and there's lots of other organizations over there, I think, doing really cool stuff, but that I know much less about. But the fact that we've now got these multilateral organizations like the World Bank taking it really seriously, many of the UN departments, to me just shows how far that's come in a relatively short space of time. So for me, it is fantastic to see that we have so many of these government teams and policy focused teams, and actually organizations outside of government starting to apply this. In terms of the academics, we reference quite a few academics that we sort of work closely with and that have inspired many of the sort of ideas and principles, from Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who obviously wrote Nudge and came up with the sort of idea of self-nudges at the sort of broader sense, to some of probably the area that I would say I'm most interested in at the minute is almost the final chapter in the book around stick and some of Angela Duckworth's work recently on grit. And I think, we're really only just scratching the surface in terms of understanding, what it is that help people persevere and follow through on these goals, and all of that stuff around non-cognitive skills, and what really, can we develop that in kids, and how do we do that? To me, that'll be a huge area of research for us to sink our teeth into over the next 5 years. So I'm super excited about that. Some of the work that we're doing here in New South Wales at the minute is really looking at some of these feedback mechanisms, and if you can build that sense of motivation and grit in everything from apprentices finishing their course through to people who have got a domestic violence order, and seeing if you can actually help them plan and follow through on changing their behaviour. So for me, if I had to pick one area out, I think that for me is the most exciting new area, this stuff around non-cognitive skills and people develop some of these sort of so-called softer skills. And that, to me, if we can understand that a bit better and know how to teach that to kids and help people do that, then I think we'll all be a lot better off.
Well, the book that I just got most recently, Angela Duckworth, Grit. So maybe we can get her for our next episode.
Nice transition.
Angela's great, and she's done a little bit of collaboration with the team. But I think it's really fascinating work, and I think probably one of the most optimistic readings of it and of that whole literature, and that we sort of linked to at the end. And Jim Heckman's work is that these sort of skills beget skills. That as we talked about a little bit, and again in a very narrow sense, but once you've started shifting from the Coke to the apple juice, or the apple to the water, similarly, as you start to build these sorts of skills where you realize actually you can make a difference in your own life, you can achieve goals, I truly believe that it becomes self-reinforcing. And the way we sort of talk about it in the book is that these tools really help you to build this behavioral scaffolding around your life. Like, we all lead super busy lives and really challenging lives increasingly. which means it is difficult to follow through on all the different things that we want to do. And so what are the ways that you can use these tools to build a behavioural scaffold, as it was, around yourself and your goal, which sort of protects you from those daily distractions and sort of demands of life, and help you follow through. And I think, if we can learn more about how you make that sort of behavioural scaffolding as robust as possible and as easy to build as possible, I'm sure in a little 5-10 years time we'll be looking back and thinking, how did we do this before? How were we all muddling through it before? Which I feel like we still are to some extent.
Well, that sounds like a great last word to me. So, Rory, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, before we cut out, like if people want to, so obviously everyone's first action item is to pick up the book, think small. And build on. I think we've given a nice preview, so we definitely want people to check it out. But how else should people keep track of your work, of the BIT's work? We'll make sure we link to some of these things when we post it out as well. But where should people learn more, keep track of you?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. So look, our Behavioural Insights blog is probably a fairly decent way, just the Behavioural Insights Team blog. If you just sign up to that, Zach mentioned it earlier, that gives a pretty good snapshot. We're blogging much more regularly than we did in the past to give a fairly regular update of the sort of work that's going on. So that's probably the first one. I'm actually not very big on social media. It's partly to make sure I do retain my bandwidth and energies for stuff like parenting at the minute, rather than getting too big on Twitter. But I think Owain is on Twitter, and BIT tweets are also on there. So there's various sort of things you can follow out there, but probably the Behavioural Insights Team blog is the main one.
Yeah, the BIT blog is an awesome resource if you want to keep track of stuff in this field. So I second that recommendation.
Perfect.
Shameless
All right,
plug.
Well, thanks for joining us, Rory. And we will talk with you all soon.
Thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Have a great evening.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is awesome. We'll talk soon. Have a good rest of the day.
Bye-bye.
See you, Rory.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Eric Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available for download on SoundCloud, YouTube, and iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once more, that is action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States, plus Toronto. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.